Thanks again for joining us.
Yeah, great to be here.
All right, y'all are good to go.
Okay. Hey, good evening, friends. My name is Mason King, and I'm the Executive Director of the Village Church Institute, and you are here for the final night of the TVCI read-along, where we're reading Dr. Peter Leithart's The 10 Commandments. And Dr. Leithart is with us here tonight, so you can see him, and everybody welcome him. So Dr. Leithart is president of the Theopolis Institute. He serves as a teacher at the Trinity Presbyterian Church in Birmingham. He's an author. He's twice served as a pastor and as a college professor. He writes a regular biweekly column at firstthings.com, where you can read him every couple of weeks. And he's also published articles in many periodicals, both popular and academic. We were just talking about the book that he wrote for us, book that we've read, and the challenge of being able to write a concise work over such a topic with so much depth. And so he would love to kind of know how it interacted with our audience, how we're working through things. It's just a joy to really kind of work through it. So Dr. Leithart and his wife, Noelle, have 10 children, 12 grandchildren. The 13th, he's saying, is on the way in the next week or so. So congratulations to you, Dr. Leithart.
Thank you.
And thanks for joining us. We're really glad to have you with us.
Yeah, thanks, Mason. It's great to be with you this evening.
Yeah. So I think that a lot of our viewers probably won't be familiar with the Theopolis Institute. So would you mind just kind of giving us a brief history of the Institute, what you're doing, and the work of promoting liturgy?
Yeah, well, I think the vast majority of people in the world are not aware of the Theopolis Institute. We're trying to correct that a little bit, but
okay.
We started the Theopolis Institute 7 years ago. It's based in Birmingham, Alabama, and our goal was to teach both pastors and lay people in the church, particularly lay leaders, to read the Bible more deeply. We're very interested in biblical understanding, and we think that there are riches and treasures in the scriptures that are often missed. So we want to focus on that. We also do a lot of work on liturgical studies, and in our minds, those two things go together. In order to be in order to be pleasing to God, our worship has to be biblically based and biblically shaped. But we believe that the Bible gives us a liturgical instruction that dovetails with the traditional liturgical tradition of the church. So we don't think that the church went off in some deviated from biblical worship for millennia and then suddenly came back to it. We think that there's a tradition there that's biblically rooted. It needs to be purified by scripture and corrected, but it's biblically rooted. And so we want to teach, again, pastors, lay leaders, lay people who are just members of churches, more about the liturgical and sacramental tradition of the church.
Okay, so what are some of the offerings of the Institute? How do you go about promoting that teaching and being able to interact with people?
We have a lot of excuse me. That was I'm still on AOL, and that was an AOL message coming through. I apologize.
I love it.
We have a number of media outlets. We have a podcast. We put out 2 podcasts a week. One is a fresh podcast that we record just a week or 2 before. And then we have a backlog of lectures by one of our colleagues, James Jordan, who taught through many biblical books, and we put out one of those as a podcast. We have a newsletter, a weekly newsletter. We put up weekly videos on our YouTube channel. The website, we have several new articles a week that deal with biblical and liturgical and cultural topics. But our main work really is to have classes. We do them mainly in Birmingham. We do week-long courses where students will come here for a week. The whole week is liturgically structured. So we do a morning prayer service, we do noon prayers, we do evening prayers. We believe that studying scriptures and worshiping God can't be separated from each other. If you're going to study scripture properly, it needs to be in a setting of liturgy. If you're going to do liturgy properly, it needs to be surrounded by biblical teaching. So these courses are set up so that they're integrating those two things. And those courses can be on biblical topics, books of the Bible. We've had courses on liturgical music. We've had a course on sacramental theology. And we also want to touch on cultural and political questions. We had a political theology course a couple years ago. One of our Theopolis fellows, Alistair Roberts, has written a lot on the theology of the sexes, and he did a course on the theology of the sexes a number of years ago, trying to work out the biblical pattern of sexuality and sexual relations. Mm-hmm. So it's a variety of different courses that we do in that form. And then we also do shorter courses, weekend courses in different places around the country. In fact, we're going to be in Dallas in early November for a weekend course that'll be what should we hope for? It'll be on Christian hope and eschatology.
Oh, wow. Is that open to the public to be able to
register
for?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just you go on our website. Go on the website, and I think we've got the link at the bottom of the homepage that will take you through to the registration page and the description of the course. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It's a modest fee. It's maybe $25 for the course for the weekend.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
You were just talking about the classes in Birmingham, and we mentioned before the call that our good friend Crystal is headed out of town.
Yeah.
Back to Birmingham, and I was about to say, team trip, let's go. We'll see Crystal and we'll go to a class.
Yes.
Hey, I'm in.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we'd love to have you. It's a great week. It ends up being a part retreat. There's a lot of instruction and study going on, but because of the worship, we eat all our meals together. We have fellowship time in the evenings. So it has the feel of a retreat. And being a teacher, I think all the important stuff is going on in the classroom while I'm talking. And then I realized after we do a couple of years of courses that actually a lot of the action of the course is taking place when students are talking to each other and I'm not around. Yeah. So there's we've developed we have a growing network of Theopolitan fans that have been to courses and they've gotten to know each other. They stay in touch, and so that's as much this is an important part of the event as the instruction itself.
Yeah, that's really special. As we were talking about TVCI and kind of working through just getting to know each other, I mentioned kind of the different environments we have. Something that's I've seen that's particular to what we do is that all of our environments have a cohort element. Speaking to what you were just talking about, we think so much of the learning, what's so important is the ability to learn, work through it together. The ability to fail, ask a question where you think, hey, I might get this wrong, or it might sound stupid, but then to have the challenge of working through it together. Yeah. So from Bible study to the training program, core classes, we've like you've said, it's not so much the person who's up there talking, but it's the ability of the individual to have to wrestle it out with others in community.
Yeah, yeah.
So, hey, we've really enjoyed reading your book. And for those of you who are watching who have questions, there are things that you'd like to talk about, this is your time. He's here to join us for this hour. So anything you want to talk about from the last month, we'll cover the last 2 commandments tonight, but then we'll just, as we go along, entertain your questions, work through things. I think Dr. Lightheart would really enjoy getting to interact with you. So if you're hesitant, if you think, oh no, I don't know if I have a good question, I just said it's okay to ask questions and let us be able to walk through them with you. So we'd love to hear from you. I know that Crystal's going to be throwing us your questions as we walk through. But hey, Nathan, anything you want to ask from chapter 9 as we just kind of launch off into the 9th commandment?
Yeah. I mean, it was a great conversation starter in my own mind of one, just listening, just committing again, your podcast that you produce, the Theopolis Institute podcast. I've been kind of keeping along with the conversation that you had on that podcast and just having that conversation in my mind all day around the ninth word. And it was really encouraging for me, challenging in places. And one of those places that I thought would be interesting for our conversation tonight is around that topic of liturgy, because it's something you think about so clearly and so helpfully for our tradition, because many people watching, I think, maybe come from non-intentional liturgical traditions. And so thinking on page 108, you say that the liturgy trains us in truth telling. And I just wonder if you could elaborate on that a little bit and help us to understand the benefits of intentional liturgy, though that sort of benefit in training us in truth telling.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a number of elements of that. And when I should say that when I speak about the liturgy. I know there's a lot of different liturgical forms. What we generally do at Theopolis is it would look like a Lutheran or an Anglican, a prayer book liturgy. So it has a certain sequence to it, and there are set prayers and set responses. It's a dialogic form. That's what I have. That's what I have in mind when I'm talking about a liturgical service. But it is, as you say, it's pre-scripted. It's been written out and planned out ahead of time. And as far as the truth telling, I think there are a number of different features of that. One important part of the liturgy, one important moment of the liturgy, typically at the beginning of a Christian liturgy, is a moment of confession. And historically, that's generally been done as at least in Protestant churches, has been done as a corporate confession. Some churches do it with a corporate confession, then a time of silence where individuals can confess on their own. But there's an encouragement to be honest in the presence of God. That's a moment that comes right at the beginning of the service. God has called you into his presence. You know that in his presence, you can't enter into his presence unless you're purified and cleansed. You need the blood of Jesus to wash you. And so, like Isaiah, we come into the Lord's presence and we cry out that we're unclean. And so the first moment is a moment of confession. And something is really happening there. I think the Lord really is hearing our prayers. The minister declares forgiveness, and there's a real moment of forgiveness and cleansing that happens. But it's also, as you say, it's a training in honesty about ourselves. It's a training in honesty toward our brothers. We're all saying it together, and you could say it's formulaic, but if we're doing it with thoughtfulness and intention, then we are confessing before God and before our brothers that we have sinned, that there's no good in us that is in our flesh. We've done what God has commanded us not to do, and we've not done what he's commanded us to do. And that's designed to be a pattern that goes beyond the liturgy. So that would be one moment, I think, in the liturgy where there's a call to truth telling. And obviously there's any kind of scripture reading, teaching, preaching is also a moment of truth telling that's supposed to challenge our self-delusions, our false thinking that about ourselves, about the world, about one another, about God. So it's we're learning to see the world through biblical eyes. We're learning to speak and name the world biblically when we're taught and hear the word of God read and hear the word of God taught.
Yeah, that's so helpful. I love too the orientation you've given us even in this introduction, and even in the book itself. Multiple times throughout the book, you've reminded us that although we tend to view the 10 words as individuals, it's also there's also a corporate element to it. Yeah. Just as this liturgy is, as you mentioned, of this call to confession, there's also a call to corporate confession, right. And that's something that's been very eye-opening for me as well in reading this book and engaging with the 10 words in this way. That's just a paradigm shift. I know, Jen, you mentioned that a few weeks ago. That was also helpful for me of seeing the 10 words as not just individual but corporate as well.
I loved, actually hated, who wants to read about the 9th word when you're on social media at all, but I loved how you had so many tie-ins for us, in particular, when you brought out the point that we tend to think of speaking truthfully to or about our neighbor, but when it comes down to our enemy, how we speak truthfully says much about what's going on inside of our hearts. I love you said it's page 110, the truthful speech is an act of love, and we are to love enemies as well as friends. I just wonder, you've already had to boil down an enormous topic into a very small book. So let's make you do more of that while we're broadcasting something live. how do you, what would you say to the social media user who is a Christ follower? Like if you had, two main points for someone to take away who is on social media, and I'm speaking even more, I'll even take it a little bit more specific. Someone who perhaps understands the power of social media, but perhaps understands the rush of excitement in using it, but perhaps not the danger involved in using it. How would you say the ninth command comes to bear on that?
Yeah, one of the points I always think of with the ninth commandment is I'm sure I quote it in the book. It's from the Luther's shorter catechism, small catechism rather, and he says that part of the ninth commandment is to put the best construction on everything. And what he means by that is you understand, you try to understand sympathetically what you hear. And I think the design of social media, or at least the operation of social media, is in the exact opposite direction. We want to make our opponent on social media look foolish, more foolish than he or she probably is. We don't want to try to receive what they have to say sympathetically and give it the benefit of the doubt, because that's not, it's this combat situation. Alistair Roberts, my colleague at Theopolis, talks about social media as being like a boxing match without a ring. So it just, you might have just start out with just two people fighting, but if you don't have a ring, then pretty soon it's just mayhem. Everybody's going to be in.
Everybody's in. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a combat that stretches out to encompass the audience as well as the boxers. So you want to. So that would be one thing, that put the best construction on everything. And the other point that I would make is it's so easy to just have a visceral reaction to something you see on social media without even stopping to think, is this accurate? Is this true? And maybe especially that happens when we have images. We'd see a little clip of something happening in, I don't know, Portland. Let's take a random example. Portland, Oregon, something's happening. We see 2-second clip and we're outraged one way or the other, because of the cops, because of the protesters. We don't know what's going on there. We have no idea what's going on there. We don't have any context for it, but we have this visceral reaction to it. And then we're also likely to, if not share it on social media, we're likely to share what we think we know with other people. And we haven't checked anything. We don't know if we're sharing accurate news or not. So, and that just becomes a massive, network of gossip, and amplified and stretched out to the globe. And that's one of the main things that the ninth word is addressing. Paul addresses it quite frequently, the gossip, and as I'm sure you all know, in a church setting, any kind of communal setting, gossip is poison, and it will dissolve community and turn it into, it really is. It creates the kind of combat that happens on social media. So those are the two things that come up are on the top of my head.
I'm sorry to hear you have a problem with gossip in Birmingham. We have eradicated it here.
Oh, good. Yeah.
For that.
Yeah, we're behind most of the other states in such things.
I also did appreciate you made a really important distinction on page 110, which is often overlooked, frankly, in commentaries and in a lot of writing that's done on women who lie in the Bible. I loved how I had read something recently, actually, that Jonathan Lehman wrote about women turning the serpent on his head. I can't remember exactly how he said. He had a really nice wording for it, but that sort of riffing on that whole Genesis 3 reference. And you pointed out here the pattern of women lying in the Bible, and you even left off a few names, which was very But you made the point there that what they're doing is a subversive way of using the serpent's weapon against him. But I know, because I've taught the Bible long enough to know, that the idea that lying can sometimes be not breaking the ninth command is a real head splitter for people.
Yeah.
What if we gave you a little more space than you had in the book to talk about that?
Yeah. Well, I think that the danger, and especially especially if you're teaching children, you teach them the ninth commandment does not say do not lie, and they say, oh goody, every child is a natural Pharisee and he's looking for a loophole. You have to teach it properly and make sure you're qualifying it properly. But there's too many examples in the Bible, I think, of women, but also there are some occasions when men use the same tactic. It's a tactic of the weak.
Mm-hmm.
You use deceptive tactics and subversive tactics, as you say, when you don't have the power to fight directly. It's interesting to see how this develops in the Bible. I think that I think it's the case that the first time you have major deception by a man is in the life of David, and he does it a number of times, always to evade or elude some enemy. He slips out of Saul's grasp a couple of times, and he uses deception. Prior to that, it's mostly women that do it, but those are in situations when David is in a vulnerable position where he's being persecuted, and it really is. I think if you think of it as a tactic of war, then that I think puts it in the right context. You're talking about the war of the serpent, the seed of the serpent against the seed of the woman, and the woman, the mother, to protect the seed. Her tactic of resistance and her tactic of war is to deceive.
Mm-hmm.
And you put it in that kind of context, and I think that relieves some of the oddity of it, because there's examples in the book of Joshua, for example, where the Lord himself instructs Israel to fight using deceptive tactics. That's how they win the second battle at Ai. They lose the first battle because Achan has stolen plunder from Jericho, and then the second time they pretend like they're being defeated, and then they attack the city. Another group attacks the city. That's a deceptive tactic, but that's the battle plan that the Lord himself gave. So it's a tactic of war, but it's a legitimate tactic of war, and in the proper context, it's the right thing to do. And there are plenty of contexts in the modern world where this would apply. I think fewer probably in our experience than in the experience of Nazi Germany, for example, or Soviet Russia, or in China today, or any of a number of countries where Christians are persecuted, and a just use of deception, I think, is a proper tactic in those settings.
So one of the other pieces of an application of the ninth commandment that was really helpful for me was on page 107. You say that deception is a lubricant of social life, from excusable courtesies to self-serving flattery, which has been called the most harmful of lies. I thought the emphasis, especially on flattery, was really helpful. I think of, say, American Idol, and these people who come before the judges haven't been told their entire lives, you're a great singer, like you're the next Kelly Clarkson, and they come up there and they start singing. You're like, you're not exactly the next Kelly Clarkson, and the judges tell them so, and they tell them the truth finally after being flattered to their entire lives. And I wonder if you see a sort of strain within the church that's similar, always want to be positive and encouraging and not wanting to tell those hard truths. And if you do see that strain, how do we combat that and wade into telling those hard truths with grace?
Yeah, well, I'll start out by saying I'm old enough to not even know who you're talking about. Who's Kelly Clarkson?
Yeah, she was. Yeah, she was. She won American Idol and like.
But yeah, I have heard of American
I'm
Idol.
probably too young to know about her. Yeah.
I have heard of American Idol, so I'm not that old, I guess.
Okay.
I didn't. Was one of the things I was going to say in response to Jen's question was to say that we speak truth even to our enemies. That was part of the context for the question about social media. That doesn't mean that the truth can be pointed and it can be hurtful in a proper way. You know, if somebody is in the grip of a lie, then it's a good thing for them to be for that lie to be punctured, and that truth to somebody like that is going to hurt. So I think that's a part of the answer, Nathan, to the question you're asking, that we're called to speak the truth. We're called to speak the truth in love, but I think our tendency, I think it's largely out of laziness, probably. Sloth is a pretty strong motivator for a lot of people. Maybe I'm just speaking for myself there. It's a lot easier to.
Oh, not me ever. No, never. Yeah.
Sloth is taken care of in Dallas too, I guess.
It's more Birmingham.
That's right.
It's the Birmingham side.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's what Crystal has to look forward to when she gets over here.
She's in trouble because she's a super hard worker.
All this depravity over here in Alabama. So now I've distracted myself. Sorry. I have to get myself back to the question you had asked. Well, I think that I think our tendency, I think often out of sloth, is to gloss over things at times when we need to speak the truth. To say that you must speak the truth doesn't mean that you must speak the truth every time that at every opportunity. We have Proverbs and other scriptures that teach us to speak in a timely way. Timeliness of speech is really crucial, but we use that as an excuse. We say it's not a good time when we really mean I just don't want to have the hassle. So I think a lot of it is sloth. I think it's cowardice. So there's some other things going on in flattery or when we dodge the responsibility of truth telling. There's all kinds of other motivations going on there, and I think that those need to be addressed too. And I guess I do go back to kind of a liturgical dimension to it, because I think if we're engaging the liturgy as it should be with consciously knowing what we're about, not just going through the motions, and properly taught about what we're doing. We are here to tell the truth about ourselves before Almighty God, who is the truth, and we're here to tell the truth about ourselves to one another. That should set a certain tone for the church. And I guess the last thing I would say too is that I think that church leaders have to take the lead and model a proper kind of truth telling, both in public speech and in exhortation, private exhortation, and counseling and that kind of thing. If you have church leaders who are too lazy or too cowardly to speak the truth, then you're going to have a church that's there's going to be a lot of things hidden under a glossy surface.
Yeah.
And that I wouldn't say that's a particularly Birmingham sin, but I think there is a southern thing there, that there's this show of politeness
Sure.
that really does hide a lot of nastiness that I think that in pastors and church leaders have to confront that, and they have to set the tone of truth telling.
I totally agree with you. I think I called it on one of our calls last few weeks, I called it Minnesota nice. which is something I read in a novel. But like, having grown up in this area and knowing the high value in social grace, so it's save face, preserve honor, because it's kind of an honor shame type thing, but it's also like I'm not going to enter in there. Which, when you talk about the difference between do not lie and do not bear false witness, like there is something to, and if you want to expound on this, I'd love for you to, but there is something to like the virtue of speaking truth in love and stepping into that hard space for the good of your neighbor. I was really struck as I was reading through what you said about the ninth commandment being saved towards the last and being the one where the neighbor actually comes into view, and where what we do towards our neighbors is how we speak about them. And gosh, if I can't tell you that throughout life, I have thought one thing about my neighbor wherever I was and said another. And how like there's this almost like primal territorial instinct to be kind and be social, but then to criticize, and how that is not, and it's just not a godly response.
Right.
But even seeking the good of your neighbor, how even putting that to death is a necessity. Yeah. So I guess there's two things there if you want to respond to those. But
yeah, well, I think that what I was thinking when in your first part of your comment was just how disruptive Jesus is in so many social settings, and it seems to come out particularly in Luke. There's this long section of Luke where Jesus just seems to be going from one dinner to another. And every time he goes into somebody's house for dinner, he makes a scene, says something that insults the host, about his practices of hospitality. You didn't wash my feet when I came in. You didn't anoint me, but this woman has. Or about the guest list. Look at, you're inviting the important people. You're not inviting the people you should be inviting. And it just. I guess in one sense you have to say that the fundamental issue is walking in step with the Spirit of Jesus and learning to follow Jesus, which includes taking up the cross that comes with that kind of disruptive truth telling. There really is suffering that comes to that. So if we need to be willing to take that up. I had another thought in response to. Can you summarize your second point again?
Yeah, basically just the inconsistency between when you live in a culture of niceness, that the outward face will not match the interior, and how that is almost, it's a common social norm that from your writing, and I think from the Christian life, that's hypocrisy, and it's an inconsistency in virtue. Right.
Yeah. And so there's a hypocrisy because it's a play acting, which is the etymology, that's original meaning of the Greek word that's behind hypocrisy. But it's also what you were saying before, I think, is an important point, that you're presenting this face of niceness, not really love. It's niceness, and niceness and love aren't the same thing. But you're doing that to their face, but then you're reserving all your criticisms, the things that they may actually need to hear from you. You're reserving that for some other time and place when they're not around. So that's that on both sides of that is a failure of love, because you're not telling them to the face, and then you're sharing, you're slandering or gossiping about them behind their back. And I think that obviously the loving speech is not necessarily soothing speech. It can be very upsetting speech, but it's necessary. And you can't have a healthy Christian community if you don't have people speaking truth to each other. That's that just devolves into all kinds of other sins.
Man, I feel like a lot of this has to do with your personality too. Which of these things is a bigger issue for you? Because then there are those of us, no one present, of course, who might be more intuitive at the truth-telling piece. And
right.
Like I really, when I read about the ninth word, I just keep thinking, why is giving encouragement not more intuitive to me? Like, I'm all about telling you, well, here's how you might, rethink your sin problem. But how often do I think, hey, I saw this? Like, Mason is such an encouraging human. Of course, now maybe I'm finding out, Mason, you were just being nice to me and you were, no, I'm kidding.
Yeah,
Like, Mason is one of those people who will walk into
The
your office.
mask is torn away.
that's right.
Job is to be like, hey, I see this in you and I love it about you and the Lord is working through you today. And I sit there and I'm like, on the one hand, I'm like, wow, I feel like a superhero now. And then on the other hand, I think, why do I never wake up in the morning wondering who I can encourage today? And so I feel like the beauty of the ninth word is no one is safe from it. No matter which ditch it is that you're leaning into, it has a way to pull you back onto the road. But man, I know for me, it's more about being like, no, I know exactly how to help you hear the truth. But it's more likely to be a corrective truth than an uplifting truth. And you need both. People need both.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think individuals have a tendency lots of different directions, but at least in those two directions. But I would also go back to the communal thing we were saying earlier, that part of the I don't want to say solution, but part of the cultivation of communion within the church is having people of both tendencies fully engaged in being themselves and following Jesus as themselves. So we need people who are disruptive truth tellers in the church. We need people who are encouragers in the church. People have different inclinations and gifts. And so that doesn't make for, I'm not saying it all easily comes out in the wash. It can be really, having those different tendencies can create a lot of tension. But I think you need those different dimensions in order to have a thriving community.
Well, I think people with whom it's safe to fail at the experiment, right? Where you can have a safe place to have someone circle back around and say, hey, you did that thing again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Get a do-over.
Yeah. Dr. Lighthart, I loved how you ended this discussion on the ninth word and how you brought it back to the truthful out is the way you say, which seems like I don't know if that's from your time in Cambridge, but that sounds like a very British way of saying things. I love it. And I saw the reminder, even you talked about earlier, the class that you guys are going to have in Theopolis about, eschatology or the end times and having our minds oriented towards that. And that was really helpful for me, just as thinking about whether I am being maligned or I have maligned someone else, whether I'm bearing the cross from speaking the truth or some other way that I'm suffering based on a breaking of the ninth commandment. It is such a helpful reminder for me of the justice of the Lord. And that one day Jesus will return and he will make everything right and the truth will come out. And so I can boldly step into things today, knowing that eventually that he will right all wrongs. And that was a helpful reminder for me.
Yeah. A couple of thoughts on that. One is that people use that phrase, the truth will out, they're thinking in kind of in the context of a liberal democratic order. The cream rises to the top, and everything works out as long as we have free debate and everything. I'm not sure that's true, but that's also not where my confidence is. It's not in the procedure of democratic debate. It's because Jesus is the truth and he's the final word. And the other more general point that I think this runs through the book. You may have touched on it in previous discussions, but it occurred to me at some point going through the 10 words that each one of them has an implied promise. We have a tendency to think of law and promise as kind of opposed to each other, but thou shalt have no other gods before me. That is a command. Don't worship other gods. But I think there's an implied promise, implied commitment on God's part. There will be a time when there are no other gods before him. Right now, we're not at that point yet. There are many pretenders and contenders, but God will defeat all his rivals. And I think that goes for the ninth word as well, that there will be a time when truth reigns, and our confidence that that's the case is because Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life.
I'd like to move us on to the 10th word so we can make it through all 10 in our time. We got about 20 minutes left. And I want to leave some time for questions at the end. We've had a few that have been piling up in the chat. So if you've got any more questions that you want to throw in the chat window, we're going to try and answer for about the last 10 minutes. Walk through your questions. She might be able to cover 3 to 5 of them. Or we could do a lightning round if you just start to populate a bunch of them. I was reading the 10th chapter, or I guess the 10th word, and got to this passage at the bottom of page 115, where you're talking about the stylistic parallel between the commandments here. And you said it shows us that we give Sabbath rest by mortifying our covetous desires. And this could be nothing. I'm just going to ask it because I was thinking, typically when I think about Sabbath rest, it's what do I get instead of what do I give? And as you've covered the corporate nature of the words and what it calls us to, is there something to the rest that we give the community, the Sabbath rest, by the way we mortify our desires?
Yeah, that's part of the connection I was making. But the structural connection has to do with the way the 2 commandments are written. You have, in both cases, you have these lists of people. In the Sabbath command, it's the list of people who are to receive rest, and then the covetous. It's there's overlap in the list. So it was that structural parallel that alerted me to this. But I think there's a theological or a kind of in principle connection that I think just even if you stick with the Sabbath as taking rest, you have things to do. Everyone has things to do all the time. You have more money you can make or more things you can accomplish, and you have to be willing to say that's stopping now for the time being, and I'm going to kill that desire for more of whatever more is, and just receive and rest in God's provision and rejoice and enjoy God's provision. So I think even at an individual level, that's the case. But yeah, the Sabbath command is phrased with I think the emphasis is on the gift of rest rather than the gift of rest that we're required to give to others, as much as or more than it's on the rest that we take. And the reason for saying that is because if it were just about taking rest, then the commandment could be a lot shorter than it is. But it goes on to list all these categories of people that should receive rest. It's addressed to an employer, a house, a head of a house, who can give servants and other members of the house rest. So I think that's part of it, is the way that's phrased. And then I also think of Jesus' Sabbath practices, which are all about giving relief to people. It's not about him taking a day off or having a weekend. And he gets into trouble for doing that, but it's not because he's breaking Sabbath. I don't think we stop and think about it. We know he couldn't have broken the Sabbath because that would have been a sin, and Jesus didn't sin. So whatever he's doing, he's not breaking the Sabbath. I think what he's actually doing, he's the only person around who's actually keeping the Sabbath, because he's giving relief to people on the Sabbath day, which is what they should be doing. Excuse me. So I think, and that definitely requires a kind of mortification of desire, because you not only have to mortify your own desires for more, you also have to mortify your desire to exploit or use or profit from other people, and give them the freedom to rejoice in God's provision that you have. So yeah, it's definitely, I think that there's a Sabbath is a kind of discipline that cultivates a gratitude that's the opposite of covetousness.
It's really helpful. Thank you.
I actually preached a really good sermon on this a while back, and one of my favorite quotes from his sermon was self-care. No, Sabbath is not about self-care, it's about self-denial. And I thought because you're denying your own comfort or ease or income for the purpose of giving rest to others. And I think that, it's classic. It's a classic example of how we read, we being the modern individualistic Christian reads that command as terminating on me versus seeing it in the other commands as communal, that the whole reason for giving it is not just so that I can thrive, but so that we, the people of God, thrive.
Right.
Yes. I think of you have a large strain in this chapter about desire and about how desire by itself is not evil, but it's what we desire. That's something we talk often about here in the Village Church Institute, is about retraining our desires. This sort of disordered loves that you talked about with Augustine, or we have people read James K. Smith in our environments, and the idea of desiring the right things. I think also of Tony Reinke's Competing Spectacles, and how in this media age, everything from TV to video games to politics to social media is all vying for our attention and wanting us to shift our desire towards them and away from Christ. And I just wonder, how do you see a desire for things of the world, desire all around us in these competing spectacles, drawing us away from Christ? And how do we retrain our desires from desiring those things to back to desiring the things of the Lord?
Yeah, I think that in a kind of ironic way, part of the issue is in a sense, a failure of desire. Because let me back up and make one comment. There's at least a strain of the Christian tradition that sees covetousness as excessively passionate desire. That the desire is too intense, and so there's the proper response is to weaken the desire. I don't think that's a biblical exhortation at all. I think one of my formative theological influences was Cornelius Van Til, an apologist and theologian at Westminster Seminary in the middle of the 20th century, and he talks about God wants us to think strongly, to feel strongly, to have strong desires and strong will. It's not that our desires should be weak, and I think that in some way the problem is that our desires are not just misplaced, but they're, in a sense, I guess I want to say they're too weak. We don't desire things strongly enough as gifts of God. We don't desire things rightly. I guess one of the examples I'm thinking of, for example, is sexual desire. Pornography provokes sexual desire, but that's not really desire for the person. It's a desire that's provoked by an image of the person, which is not the person, and the desire is just for this flat, titillating image, not the wonder of a person made in the image of God. So our desires are too easily satisfied. I guess that's what I'm saying. And pornography is an easy satisfaction of something that should be profound, that should be an encounter that's profound enough for God to use it as a way of describing His relationship with His people. So I think that's part of it. I've been reading through the Centuries of Meditation of Thomas Traherne, an Anglican, 17th century Anglican, and this is a major theme of his meditations: is delight in God's works and a recognition that God has given all these things to us. Paul says that all things are ours. So that was another thing. I think part of my answer would be the recognition of what we actually do have in Christ. That it's Christ, it's fellowship with God, it's the gift of the Spirit. But Paul says all things are yours. whether life or death or things present or things to come, all are yours because Christ, because you belong to Christ and Christ belongs to God. So that recognition that everything that God has created is ours for our delight, for our enjoyment. That I think that would be part of the retraining that would be needed.
We've got a couple questions that have come through. When we covered the commandment over the Sabbath, we kind of walked through, with members of the team who were here that week, we kind of walked through what Sabbath looked like for us. And as you responded to my question earlier, I just wanted to ask, how would you encourage Christians now to think through the ways that they Sabbath, or what Sabbath might look like, in a way that proactively gives rest to others by what we abstain from?
Mm-hmm.
And what that might look like, what practices might look like in your own home.
Yeah. On the first part of that, I think the easiest application to make is for somebody who has the authority to decide schedules. And so, if you're an employer, I think the obvious way that you grant rest is by actually giving people Sunday off. Every business should be Chick-fil-A, right? And I was surprised. I was in Poland a couple years ago with a Polish friend told me that they still have Sunday laws in Poland. Certain shops are closed on Sunday by law. We still have kind of remnants of that in some parts of the United States. But anyway, I think that I'm not necessarily advocating for blue laws or Sunday laws as legislation, but employers can certainly do that. People who have charge of others can provide that. I think another one of the things that our church did when I was a pastor in Idaho, a lot of the students we were a college church in large measure, and a lot of the students would spend part of their Sundays visiting old folks' homes and singing for the people in the old folks' homes. So they're giving, they've got deadlines, school deadlines, but they're giving up part of their study time in order to give delight to these older folks. That kind of ministry of mercy, I think, is a good application of what the Sabbath command is tells us, and certainly it's an application of what Jesus was doing. I think that speaking of my own family, I think our practice of the Sabbath has been best in those places where we were part of a community that did it together. That was and I don't mean necessarily a town, but a church community that had a common vision of what the Sabbath was for. And so in those kind of settings, you can, there's a lot of mutual hospitality that takes place on the Lord's Day. People spending long stretches of the day with other families in the church. I think another I think important emphasis, especially over against some of the practices of the church historically, is biblically the Sabbath is one of the feast days, and I think it's a day of joy. It's not. I think there's been a wrong kind of self-denial, I guess, that has been worked into the Sabbath keeping, and it's the old Chariots of Fire scene where Eric Little tells the kid kicking the ball that Sabbath's not a day to be kicking a football, is it? Yeah. Well, I think that Sabbath is a day to be kicking a football. I think that's it's a day for enjoyment. It's a day for delighting in what God has given us. So I think that action has to be there. So hospitality, music, singing, those things would characterize Sabbath keeping when we were, especially when we were with other families that were doing the same.
Yeah. We've talked about that of just, we have a family here in town that their children are near the age of ours, and we've just tried to set aside, 2 to 3 weeks in a non-COVID reality. Before we're still trying to figure it out for right now, but 2 to 3 weeks a month of cooking dinner together, letting the kids play, kind of having our day where we put everything that's outside reaching to bed on Friday afternoon, but then like Saturday night, we kind of close the Sabbath by getting together and celebrating.
Mm-hmm.
But my mind has just been stirring in this conversation, even as you gave the example of people who would go to help and heal others and to do good and to bring life for them. Just the notion of someone going and singing in the nursing home and bringing joy to someone, or bringing them rest in a way where they're deprived of that so many other days. That's really just that's added a dimension to it for me. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. I think that we should see that not as an exception, which is the way that sometimes it's characterized, that works of mercy are allowed. I think that's not the way that we should think. God wants us to give people relief, and this is a way of giving people relief.
I think we slip into that because we detach the command from the rest of what the Old Testament says regarding Sabbath law, like Jubilee and forgiveness of debts and freedom of slaves. Right. It has everything to do with relief. Again, when we make it about just me and we miss the bigger concept, I think is when we get into those patterns.
Right. Yeah, and I think the Sabbath command is one of several in the 10 words that highlights for Israel, it had been a national character of these commandments, that you can't do Sabbath keeping in the way that the Old Testament portrays it unless you have a whole people doing it together. So I think it's got to be individual families can do certain things, but I think to really make it effective, it has to be at least a segment of the church committed to a festive Sabbath keeping.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the modern day expressions I've seen of this that's pretty cool is how churches will take up funds, and there's a nonprofit organization that forgives medical debt. Have you seen this in the headlines? It's fascinating to me. Yeah. So they can take $3,000 and turn it into forgiveness of $30,000 worth of medical debt, because they're basically purchasing debt from who it's been written off to. And but it's a really tangible way of granting relief within your community that you can do so much better when you're doing it together versus if one person were trying to pull together and do something like that. And so all these people in a town will get letters. I was reading about a church who did this up in the Baltimore area. But it's just to me, that's a beautiful expression of this Sabbath command working it out into the community. And these people don't even know who gave the money or anything. All they know is that they've been crushing medical debt. And awesome. How cool it would be if churches thought more expansively in terms of how they might be operating out of a Sabbath principle like that. Mm-hmm. How it would really change our community.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the way that the full biblical picture of the Sabbath expands in just that way. It becomes a way of conceiving society in general. So the gleaning laws, and as you said, Jubilee, manumission of slaves at the 7th year. And Isaiah 58 is one of the great passages. It talks about fasting largely. Mm-hmm. The true fast is to give your clothing to the hungry, to the naked, and your food to the hungry, and shelter to the homeless. But then it shifts into Sabbath keeping at the end of the chapter. And I think those two things are intimately related. It's a vision of true Sabbath when there's a not just one day of the week, but it becomes a habit characterizing a whole community of generosity and hospitality and giving rest.
Yeah. Okay, I know it's 9 o'clock, Mason, and I know we're out of time, but I want to ask Dr. Lightheart one more question.
One more, let's go.
Which was your favorite of the 10 words to spend time thinking about and writing about?
I actually think that, let's see.
If you had to stand on one foot and recite, no, I'm kidding.
Yeah.
Recite the whole law.
I think it probably was the Sabbath command that probably grew most in my thinking. I had already made some connections, but I don't think I had quite seen the full scope of it before. And then I also was intrigued by the way that the fourth and fifth commandments work together in some contexts, where you have Sabbath command of giving relief and honoring parents are brought together. So part of the way that you honor parents is by caring for them and giving relief in especially in old age.
Well, Dr. Lightheart, we've reached the end of our hour. And friends, this is the end of week 8. So the end of the summer with TVCI Read Along. We're really thankful that you've joined us. Dr. Lightheart, what a joy to be with you, to get to talk with you tonight about your book, The 10 Commandments from Lexham Press, part of their series. And gosh, the Christian Central series. What a joy to read this book. We were talking before we got started tonight, a book that is super accessible, but has so much depth in it. I mean, if you were to go back and watch our recording from the first week, as we talked through the aspects of biblical theology, just the tracks you laid down to think through this work, you did just a wonderful job. And it was such an enjoyable read. And I know many who have read it have told us how much they've liked it. So friends, go get yourself a copy and give it away and invite a friend to read it with you. And so Dr. Lightheart, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
It really
all.
was a pleasure.
Enjoyed it a lot. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Friends, I don't know when we're going to do this next, so it might be a little while, but we'd love to hear from you. You can find us on Instagram. Nathan, what's our Instagram handle? TVCI Institute?
At TVC Institute.
Yeah, the I would be repetitive at that point. So TVC Institute. And Nathan runs that for us. You can interact with us there. Thanks for joining us. Have a good night. Crystal.